Hey, this is Eric, Little Feather White. I'm back on YouTube for another live reading of Native American Tribes, The History and Culture of the Mohegan by J. Moore and Charles River, editors. The Narragansett Sachem, Mayan Tanomi, was weighed down by a heavy vest of mail armor, loaned to him by an English friend, was unable to quickly flee the scene and was taken prisoner by the Mohegans. Mayan Tanomi tried to convince his captors to join his anti-English alliance, but Uncas refused and conveyed him to Hartford to let the English to decide his fate. Excuse me. After much frenzied consultation among both the political and religious leadership in Hartford and Boston, the colonial authorities decided that Mayan Tanomi ought to be put to death, since it was evident that Uncas would never be safe with him still alive. To keep their own hands clean, they returned Mayantonomi back to Uncas' custody to be executed in his own jurisdiction, not in the English plantations. Although it was specified that it was to be done without cruelly torturing him in the customary manner of the Indians, Uncas' brother took care of the task on their return trip, striking Mayantonomi on the head with his hatchet from behind. The English had sent two of their men along as witnesses for the execution, and dispatched some musketeers to stay with Uncas in case the Narragansett sought revenge of his death. Some say Uncas celebrated his victory by eating a slice of flesh from his enemy's shoulder. Mayantonomi's brother, Pisiskis, who succeeded him as Sachem, was certainly eager to exact revenge. The Narragansetts were doubly incensed at Mayantonomi's death because they had paid Uncas a sizable ransom in wampum in order to liberate him, a point which Uncas vociferously denied. As a result, the commissioners of the newly formed United Colonies of New England invited both Uncas and representatives from the Narragansetts to come to Hartford to state their respective sides of the matter. Narragansetts left the proceedings displeased when the English ruled that they had not proven their case against Uncas, stipulating that they could not attack the Mohegans until they had done so. The Narragansetts would only promise not to attack the Mohegans until after the following year's corn planting season. They also agreed that before launching an attack, they would give 30 days' notice to the colonial governors. Around the same time the Narragansetts tried a gambit, the Mohegans would later try in the 18th century, trying to go over the colonial heads to the royal authorities, with the hope of establishing themselves as co-equals with the Puritans under the English king. In July of 1645, with war seeming imminent, the commissioners of the United Colonies sought to get both the Mohegan and the Narragansett sachems to meet in Boston. Instead, the Narragansetts heaped scorn on the notion, sending gifts to Boston with the offer to remain at peace with the colonists as long as they were allowed to go to war with the Mohegans. Their proposal was refused. The Puritans declared they would support Uncas and seriously mobilize for war. The Narragansetts were forced to back down, agreeing to pay a large indemnity in wampum, providing four Sachem's sons as hostages, and returning all the men, women, and children in canoes they had taken from the Mohegans. Thus, the Mohegans were saved from another major onslaught. Uncas had once more managed to dodge the arrows of the angry Narragansetts. However, Uncas' disposition, coupled with his inclination to throw his weight around in an attempt to expand his influence and collection of tribute, would lead the Mohegans into repeated conflicts with other Indian nations. His confidence was no doubt bolstered by the expected support of the colonial authorities in 1656. After first appealing to them, as was his customary practice, Uncas moved to attack the Podunk Indians to his north. The reason for the attack was to retaliate after the Podunk murdered a Sagamore Indian related to Sequasin, who was now Uncas' ally. Uncas withdrew without fighting after finding his warriors equally matched on the battlefield in favor of a crafty stratagem. First, he threatened that he would bring the widely feared Mohawks down on their heads and then sent one of his warriors at night to burn a podunk wigwam and leave Mohawk style weapons scattered nearby. The plan and evidence helped to convince the Podunks that Uncas' threat had been genuine, and they sued for peace and gave up the man who had committed the murder. The Narragansetts still harbored a burning desire to get back at Uncas. Several times over the next decades, Pasaka's warriors and their allies, Ho had by now acquired the superior weaponry of firearms, put Uncas forts under siege when the situation seemed dire for Uncas' survival. Captain John Mason, now in charge of the colony's fort at Saybrook at the mouth of the Connecticut River, saved him by sending in soldiers and supplies. The besiegers retreated rather than tangle with the English, and the Mohegans rushed from their fort in precipitous flight, similar to the battle they fought in 1643. Colonial authorities eventually found having to intervene time and again on Uncle's behalf, a matter of some annoyance at one point. Excuse me. The commissioners even had to mediate a dispute between Uncas and his brother, Wawukwa, but they continued to stand by him. Uncas had an agenda of his own that he was going to push, and he often tested his limits as a result. In year 1661, the English had to scold Uncas severely after a Mohegan war party led by Uncas' son, Onwanaco, made a raid against the Quabogs in Massachusetts, killing several of them and taking others captive. The English had to intervene again in 1666 when Uncas led a hunt violating Podunk territory to the north. That case was settled when two sides agreed on a boundary line to divide them, and an arraignment that Podunk Sachem gave his daughter in marriage to Uncas' third son, Ottawan Armament then deeded all of his lands to his daughter and new son-in-law, thus expanding the Mohegan domain. At first, the Mohegans under Uncas were greatly appreciated by the white settlers as they helped defend Connecticut's weak young settlements from the attack by other Indians. Benjamin Trumbull, in his 18th century History of Connecticut, observed, "The Mohegans were a great defense and of essential service to the town of Norwich for many years. They kept out their scouts and spies and so constantly watched their enemies that they gave the earliest notice of their approach and were a continual defense against them. For this purpose, in times of danger, they often moved and pitched their wigwams near the town, and were a great terror to the enemy. Once the hostile Indians came near to the town, upon the Sabbath, with the design to make a descent upon it, but viewing it from an eminence and seeing the Mohegans' huts, they were intimidated and went off without doing the least damage. In the meantime, Uncas was having internal problems assimilating the Pequot captives into his tribe. In year 1647, over 60 of them petitioned the English authorities that they were being mistreated by Uncas in spite of their faithfulness to him and their precipitation in his wars. They were being forced, they said, to pay large amounts of wampum as tribute to him, and that he had taken one Pequot's man's wife for his own. The Pequots asked to be freed from their subjugation to Uncas and put under the protection of the English. John Winthrop Jr., son of the Puritan founding father and longtime Massachusetts governor, who had established a plantation in Pequot country and intensely disliked Uncas, supported the petition. The United Colonies Commissioner found the evidence compelling, and Uncas was rebuked for his sinful miscarriages, fined 100 fathoms of wampum, forced to pay damages to Pequot, and had to agree that he will govern them no differently than his own people in the future. In the future, although enjoined to rejoin the Mohegans, the Pequots continued to live apart on their former land base under their own sachems. Eventually, the Connecticut government provided them with two small reservations of their own where they were able to remain living as Pequots, one of which still exists today. During the Great Indian Rebellion of year 1675 and year 676, known by the English as, quote, King Philip's War, and, quote, the Mohegans under Uncas supported the colonial site with military assistance, as did the Pequots. In the fall of the year 1675, when Mohegans accompanied the Connecticut force sent to protect a Massachusetts town on the Connecticut River, both the Mohegan and Pequot warriors were present present to to aid the colonial militia at the crucial battle with the Narragansetts in December year 1675, known as the quote Great Swamp Fight, excuse me, end quote. Both the Mohegans and the Pequots were involved in the capture and execution of Canochet, the Narragansett Sachem in April year 1676, and in June 1676, 200 Mohegans and Pequots accompanied Major Tolcutt's Connecticut force of 250 colonial soldiers into Massachusetts, arriving in the nick of time to save the town of Hadley, which was under ferocious attack by King Philip's warriors. The aging Uncas took no direct part in King Philip's war, but his son Almaneko took part, leading a Mohegan contingent into battle. At the war's end, as had been the case with the Pequot War, the Mohegans picked up some of the captured or surrendered Indians and added them to the tribe. Along with Uncas and his son, Foxon, was another important Mohegan during this time period. Uncas' trusty counselor Foxon was considered by other New England Indians to be one of the wisest Indians in the country. He was sometimes called upon to argue Uncas' case before the English authorities, and his name appears on some deeds as a witness for the Mohegan Sachem as a result. Uncas died in year 1683. He was buried near a waterfall on the Yantic River in Norwich, Connecticut, and a plot with other Mohegan notables have been buried. A granite obelisk erected in year 1842 marks his grave. Uncas's historical reputation continues to be a matter of debate among Indians and historians alike. Although he opportunistically sided with the white invaders and acted querulously toward many other Indians, he was able through the long decades of his sacramentum to preserve the integrity of his tribe by becoming a skillful power broker in relations between whites and natives. As the historian Michael Oberg concludes, his biography of Uncas, he played as large a role in the history of this part of Anglo America, a region shaped by English settlers and by Indian natives, as any other individual. Though the English increasingly dominated and dictated the nature of the Anglo-Indian exchange, and though the Mohegans lost nearly all of their lands by the beginning of the 18th century, the Mohegans survived as a community along the Thames River and along the margins of colonial society. Uncas's descendants still live along the Thames today. They owe him much. Uncas was succeeded by his son Almaneko. His other son Altawanhud, or Joshua as he was sometimes called by the whites, had died at the end of King Philip's War. Almaneko was a generous man, having been reputed to have given land to two whites as thanks for saving him from drowning after he fell from his canoe. He also gave land to the crippled son of a friendly neighboring white family. He was also known to be partial to alcohol and was in debt to whites because of it. As a result, Owaneko signed over many parcels of Mohegan land and throughout eastern Connecticut to pay his creditors or to unscrupulous land-hungry whites. This signing over of land led to legal complications subsumed in the now famous Mohegan land controversy of the 18th century. Not only did the controversy embroil the colony of Connecticut for many decades, but it also led to splits within the Mohegan tribe. Chapter 2: The Mohegan Land Controversy. Starting with Almaneko and continuing under his successors as Sachem, the Mohegans were involved in an epic legal struggle with the Connecticut colony over their lands that lasted over 70 years. During the struggle, a few white settlers took up the side of the Mohegans against other white settlers. The imperial authorities in London were also involved in the controversy to hold hearings and make rulings at several key points. Going through the arcane details of the prolonged legal struggle, excuse me, even a simplified version of it may seem unnecessary, let alone tedious to the modern reader and history lover. Even so, this history from the 17th and 18th centuries was very important to the participants and demonstrates the resourcefulness of the Mohegans in trying to leverage a very different system of jurisprudence than their own in order to preserve what they could of their land base, which was under serious and repeated threats from land hungry whites as Connecticut's population grew larger and larger. The Mohegan case was also the first many court cases involving Native Americans in what became the United States and has been cited in other later cases. In this prolonged legal battle, Connecticut's um, influential Mason family, although not totally disinterested, took the Mohegan side against the white faction that was usually in control of the Connecticut colonial government in Hartford. The relationship between the Mason family and the Mohegans went back to the Pequot War when Uncas and John Mason developed a close personal relationship. After the war, Mason took the role of the protector. Um, of the Mohegans upon himself. Together, they made repeated efforts to secure land for the Mohegans through utilizing the mechanisms of English property law. And in 1659, Uncas and his brother Wawokwa turned their lands over in trusteeship to Mason. The next year, when he was lieutenant governor, Mason surrendered whatever his right was in those lands to the colony of Connecticut, which, with the exception of his own farm, on a condition that the Indians should at all times afterward be provided with a sufficient quantity of land on which to plant. Next, in year 1665, Uncas and his sons Awanako and Ottawan signed over to Mason, quote, one half of the profit and value of all such lands, woods, ponds, minerals, herbage, rents, and etc. And Mason bound over an entail, meaning the estate could not be divided as it passed down to the next generation, a tract of land for the Indians. Once more in year 1671, as he was dying of cancer, Mason bound the same tract of land, lying between the towns of New London and Norwich, over to Uncas and his sons. This was a tract of land which the deed explicitly stated could never be divided or sold by the Sachems or their successors. The land was what remained of a 9 mile square tract of land that the Mohegan Sachems had sold in the year 1659 to the 35 proprietors of the town of Norwich, but which did not fall inside the town's boundaries when it was surveyed and recorded. Among the proprietors were Madge Mason, the Reverend James Finch, and Lieutenant Thomas Leffingwell. The man who had brought a canoe full of badly needed food to Uncas besieged fort. This tract became known as the quote sequestered lands end quote and contained the main village and planting fields of the Indians. It was also the main subject in further disputes between the Mohegans and the colony. The original dimensions of the sequestered lands were 8 miles long and 4 miles broad, which consisted of approximately 20,000 acres. After Maj, John Mason's death, his son Maj, Samuel Mason, acted as the protector of the Mohegans until his own death in 1705. The role was taken on by Captain John Mason, the grandson of the original John Mason. His father, also named John Mason, had died in King Philip's War. Finally, after Captain John Mason's death, the role of protector of the Mohegans was taken by his two sons, Samuel and John Mason. Allied with intermarried Allied and intermarried, with the Masons was the Fitch family, whose members supported the Mohegan cause and who had also acquired some land. In May year 1681, shortly before his death, wisely looking to the future needs of his people after he was gone, Uncas entered into a quote league of amity end quote with the colony of Connecticut. He pledged the Mohegans eternal friendship and promised that for himself, his successors, and heirs no more land would be sold, quote, without their grant and allowance first had and obtained, end quote. What the Mohegans had to offer the colonists besides land were Indian allies in warfare, which had proved just as useful in King Philip's War. Uncas promised to supply a quote competent number of fighting men end quote to help defend the colony in the future. Quote, when their peace shall be disturbed by an enemy intestine or foreign end quote. For its part, the Connecticut General Court said it would protect the Mohegans from being wronged and would extend equal justice to them quote, as their own people, end quote. The most important clause with regards to the subsequent legal struggles that broke out over Mohegan land was the following. Quote, whatever plantations we grant to any people in their country and territories, they shall take care that a sufficient uh, efficiency of land for the said Indians and their successors be still preserved preserved for them to plant on, and that a just price be paid for the residue, as shall be agreed. End quote. Uncas had also asked the general court to demarcate his lands from those held by the neighboring town of New London. Onwineko, Uncas' son and successor, likewise tried to leverage the white legal system to protect the lands remaining to himself and his people. In year 1680, conscious that he might well regret putting his signature on documents when under the influence of alcohol at a later date, Onwineko asked Captain James Finch Jr., the son of Norwich minister, and whose stepmother was the daughter of John Mason, to be his guardian, the cosign and to co-sign the sale of any land given to him by his father, in order for the sales to be valid. In year 1684, after his father had died and he had become chief sachem, Oweneko signed a quitclaim for the rest of the Mohegans, in which he relinquished to the tribe any personal claim to the sequestered lands. Still lacking confidence, in year 1691, the General Court approved his request that no lands could be sold by he or his son and heir, Mohammed, without Samuel Mason's specific approval. Finally, in 1710, with the support of his counselors and other chief members of the tribe, Oweneko tried to secure what he could of the sequestered lands by dividing them into two parts. While the western part was sold to four white men for 50 dollars in their currency. Um, the eastern part bordering the river, which amounted to 4 or 5,000 acres, was put into a deed of filafment, a kind of trust that the wording said would belong to the Mohegans, quote, so long as there shall be any Mohegan found or known alive in the world, end quote. At least Oweneko had hope. Another stratagem that Oweneko and his Mason advisors used when working with the foreign political system imposed on the Indians was to go over the heads of the often unsympathetic Connecticut authorities by taking their case to the royal authorities in England. The first time this happened was in the year 1703, when believing that the Mohegans were being dispossessed of their lands, when the Connecticut General Court added their sequestered lands to a new parish in the town of New London, and and they complained to Queen Anne. Queen Anne received Owaneko's petition and appointed a commission to look into the matter. Headed by Massachusetts Governor Dudley, who was no friend of the Connecticut authorities, the commission held a one-day hearing at Stonington, Connecticut in year 1705. It ruled on behalf of the Indians when the Connecticut authorities refused to participate, ordering that the Indians should be restored forthwith, quote, to the possession and enjoyment, end quote, of all their planting lands, consisting of sequestered lands between New London and um, New London and Norwich, and a smaller tract in New London, two large outlying tracts in Colchester and Lynn, traditionally used by the Mohegans for hunting purposes, were included as well. The commission ordered that the Indians should be restored forthwith, quote, to the possession and enjoyment, end quote, of all their planting lands, the sequestered lands lying between New London and Norwich, and a smaller tract in New London, along with two large outlying tracts in Colchester and Lynn, that the Mohegans traditionally used for hunting purposes. The latter two tracts had been granted by the General Court to create the towns without ever gaining Mohegan consent. At the request of Oweneko, the commission appointed Captain John Mason as the Mohegans' guardian. The Connecticut authorities appealed the ruling against them, whereupon the Crown authorized the creation of a sort of appeals court called a, quote, commission of review, end quote. The commission never met, and the ruling of the first commission was not carried out by the Connecticut authorities. The Connecticut General Court ordered its own investigation, and in year 1721 affirmed English ownership of all the lands under dispute except for the remaining sequestered lands at Mohegan. Connecticut was now far from the wars between the English colonists, the French, and their Indian allies in Canada, and was much less concerned about having Indian allies, such as the Mohegans, to help defending their colony in the past. Okay, that's enough reading for this evening. I'm going to check back at another date, at a later date, to finish reading. Thank you for coming to my page and checking me out. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me read. May you have a blessed day, and I'll check back with you again another time. Thank you. This is Eric Clarence Little Feather White, and I'm out. Peace.